she now regretted. In some ways, it had been a lifetime since she'd last faced her Amish community, yet the quaking of her insides said it had been only yesterday. The gray-haired woman hung up the phone. "Can I help you?"
"Yes, I need the room numbers for Matthew and David Esch."
The woman typed on the keyboard and studied the screen. She frowned and typed in more info. "We have a Matthew Esch, but there's not a David Esch listed." She jotted down the room number on a small piece of paper. "It's possible he's already been released, or perhaps was taken to a different hospital."
"Maybe so. I'll ask Matthew."
Hannah took the paper from her.
"Thank you."
She went to the elevator, trying to mentally prepare to face Matthew's visitors. People she knew, people she was related to, those who'd accused her of wrongdoing before they washed their hands of her. Nonetheless, she'd come home. Here, not home. She corrected herself and felt a morsel of comfort in the thought. These people didn't own her and had no power to control her, not anymore. She stepped off the elevator and headed toward Matthew's room. Odd, but the place appeared empty of any Amish. She gave a sideways glance into the waiting room as she passed it. There were no plain folk in there, either. Stopping outside the room, Hannah said a silent prayer. Ready or not, she pressed the palms of her hands against the door and eased it open. A man lay in the bed, but she couldn't see his face for the bandages across his eyes. He turned his head toward the door. "Hello?" His voice echoed through the room.
"Matthew?"
His forehead wrinkled above the bandages, and he clenched his jaw. "Just go home, or wherever it is you're living these days. I got no more use for you." She froze. If this was what awaited her from Matthew, one of her few friends, what would the community be like? But maybe the man wasn't Matthew. His body was larger, shoulders thicker and rounded with muscle. His voice was raspy and deeper than she remembered. And Matthew would have visitors, wouldn't he?
"Matthew?"
He shifted in the bed, angling his head. It's Hannah." Only the soft buzzing sound of electronics could be heard as she waited for his response. Wondering 1,000 things, whether the eye damage was permanent, why he didn't have a marriage beard, and where everyone was, she moved closer to the bed. Finally, he reached his hand toward her. Hannah Lapp, at last back from the unknown world. Ignoring his unsettling tone, she put her fingers around his outstretched hand and squeezed. "How are you?" The stiltedness of their words said a lot more than 2.5 years had passed between them. He shrugged and then winced, reminding her of the pain he must be in. "I've lost David, and every part of my business. How do you expect me to be?"
"David is dead?"
The news twisted her insides, making her fight to respond.
"I'm so sorry, Matthew."
He eased his hand away from hers. "I'm grateful you came all this way, but I'm too tired to talk right now."
"Sure, I understand. Where is everyone?"
The door swooshed open and a nurse walked in. "I'm sorry, miss, he's not to have visitors." She held up a laminated printed sign that said "No visitors allowed." It had slipped off his door. That explained why he didn't have friends or relatives here, but he didn't appear to be in bad enough shape for a doctor to give that order. Hannah studied the nurse, but she just shook her head without saying more. The only reason he wouldn't be allowed to have visitors was because he'd requested that of the staff, and clearly he didn't want to make an exception for her.
"Okay."
She slid her hand into his once more, wishing she could at least know more about the condition of his eyes. But he seemed in no mood for questions.
"I'll come back when you're feeling better."
"There's no sense in that. I'm going home tomorrow, but David's funeral is Monday." His voice cracked, and he took a ragged breath. "If you're still here, we could meet up afterward while Mom and everyone is distracted with the gathering at the house." The words Matthew didn't say weighed heavily. He didn't want her going into the community to see anyone. He wanted to meet her alone, in secret. Unable to respond, she grappled with the space separating them. She'd expected distance from her dad and Mam, the church leaders, and even Graham, but she hadn't for 1 second thought Matthew would sidestep her. He'd understood, even disobeyed the bishop.